That's like a classic Anadrol scenario. You would think, oh, this guy must love Anadrol. In his heyday, back when he was, peaking for these massive deadlifts, he must have been using a ton of Anadrol, like a lot of the other powerlifters. However, he said when he used it, he got next to nothing out of it. What's up, guys? Derek, moreplates.com. Today we're going to be talking about genetic response again, kind of revisiting the performance enhancing protocol model, designing something that is tailored for an individual. Like, what are the optimal choices for performance vectors in fill in the blank sport versus in bodybuilding versus in powerlifting versus in strongman versus in arm wrestling versus in fucking playing chess, whatever it is that you would be using a performance enhancing compound for. How do you know what you should be doing? Well, I have outlined a general framework for understanding which compounds, really have the best safety profile relative to their efficacy, have, human data to reinforce all of that, are tried and true, have, are more well tolerated than another compound that may yield the exact same amount of muscle accrual, at least on paper. The thing is, though, is when it comes to practical application of these compounds, it doesn't always play out where one equals the best for this person, despite it on paper, anecdotally, years and years of bodybuilders using it, whatever athlete using it, reinforcing that it is a pretty tried and true compound. It does not mean that that is going to be a tried and true compound for you. And what do I mean by that? So, like, in general, a framework that a lot of people will follow is, like a testosterone base, and then you stack anabolic agents on top of that. And then, when you're trying to decide what those anabolic agents will be, it kind of depends how prone you are to estrogenic side effects from your base, how high your androgen load has been pushed from the testosterone base itself. Do you need any antagonism of estrogen-induced RNA transcription with a compound that is more inhibitory of that kind of, or has a higher affinity for binding to aromatase and competing with testosterone? Or are you just looking to drive volume with the 19 nor? Or like again, when it comes down to these decisions, like the framework in general for a lot of people though is, well, I guess most people are just using like the same cycles from back in the day, a 500 base with throwing in, let's throw in, 400 deca or 400 tren or, fucking 600, 700 EQ, because we all know that EQ doesn't work at anything less than 700 for some reason, which obviously is bullshit, but that's just, something, again, one of the things that's permeated throughout the industry over the years, from the forums. But again, it's not like anyone really knew a lot better like back then. It's just, this is the kind of shit that's been passed down through the grapevine. And it's not like there's more information available to believe otherwise. When you read Llewellyn's book saying that EQ aromatizes at 50% the rate of testosterone into estrogen, it's like, why would I not believe that? I assume this is the fucking premier book outlining all of the information that is accurate because it's literally cited by fucking Wikipedia. So it's like this is the kind of shit, the logic you will come to when you're learning about this stuff, and you arrive at a lot of conclusions that may be correct, but a lot of shit is, may not be applicable or correct for you personally. So again, when it comes down to genetic response to certain compounds, there's a reason why certain guys prefer certain things. So on paper, despite it being, let's just say one is equal to another in a protein expression context, when it comes to driving actual performance metrics, it's like, obviously not everyone is using these compounds just to get jacked. Like, obviously people want to get jacked when they use it a lot of the time, but there are a lot of people using these compounds to drive neurological adaptations, to drive force production, to drive this, a bunch of different shit. People are using it for actual sports relative to just, what most people think. It's like, well, let's just get as big as fucking possible. Like, there are specific applications for these compounds at the end of the day with a lot of the users. And when one person responds well to a compound, it doesn't mean that that is the superior agent, even though on paper, perhaps has an overall better profile when you're factoring in clinical research, safety, etc. And I'm not saying you should steer away from those compounds, because again, at the end of the day, that's your first thing to lean on, is the shit that has the most data reinforcing it. and is hopefully the one you respond well to, because you don't want to be using a compound that's subpar simply because, like for whatever reason. But again, is there ever a time where it makes sense to look elsewhere? Well, again, obviously it depends on what side effects you're prone to and whatnot. But when it comes to, like, let's just say, a compound like Dianabol versus Anadrol. This is a very, very classic comparison of two oral agents that are traditionally used in a, bulking context, or to try and drive acute performance outcomes, pre-workout, or to, like in general, they're used to, gain aggressive amounts of size and or strength in like a short window of time in general. They're not necessarily the backbone of your anabolic activity. Rather, they are used for non-genomic actions in the body rather than, direct AR activation, which traditionally is what you're going to use like a, pure protein expressive compound for. Like if you're using something like a Primobolan, you're not expecting a lot of satellite interaction with shit that is going to result in a significant amount of water retention or a significant amount of, acute drive pre-workout, or like things of this nature are going to be like, when you actually look at the binding affinity of some of these orally active androgens, it's like relatively benign, if not non-existent, to the point of being undetectable. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not going to do anything. As you see, they have pretty fucking potent effects. And their metabolites obviously have their own inherent activity at these receptors too. But in general, like off-target interaction is shit you can't necessarily predict how you're going to respond to. And there's a reason why certain individuals will simply respond better to one compound than the other. So every time this debate comes up, like Dianabol versus Anadrol, like which one is better, there will be a mixed bag of comments. There's going to be individuals who literally, Anadrol is the best fucking thing ever. D-ball, makes them a bloated, Pillsbury doughboy, and they fucking hate it, and it's not as good in the strength department as Anadrol, and it bloats them, and it gives them nosebleeds, and it gives them back pumps, and blah, blah, blah. Dianabol sucks, Anadrol is the king. Then there's individuals who take Anadrol and respond like shit. All they do is they lose their hair. They don't get any really significant benefits from it. This is a minority, well, not a minority who loses their hair, but a minority of individuals who don't get the effects that they're seeking from it and respond far more favorably to a Dianabol. Now, on paper, something like, a Dianabol versus an Anadrol, like you might think you know what to expect based on a lot of anecdotal feedback, clinical research, blah, blah, blah. But again, at the end of the day, individual response will ultimately dictate what your body responds to. Like it wasn't that long ago that Pete Rubish, one of the OG, fitness, he's not like a fitness YouTuber. He's like a very accomplished powerlifter, but he's also a guy who posts on YouTube. And he was one of the first transparent individuals about anabolics on YouTube. And he had a pretty viral Trenbolone video back in the day where he talked about, what effects it has on him, what sides he experiences, what doses he's used, how it's helped him in his powerlifting endeavors, etc. And more recently, he's actually come off of gear cold turkey, and he has recovered to a natural baseline, functioning just off his endogenous hormone production. And he himself has noted, despite being a powerlifter who literally is reliant upon, acute neurological adaptations to the gym, like you literally take some shit to get as fucking riled up and hyphy as you can, and to have insane just fucking force production in one concentrated movement in one concentrated short acute period of time. That's like a fucking classic Anadrol scenario. You would think, oh, this guy must fucking love Anadrol in his heyday, back when he was, peaking for these massive deadlifts. He must have been using a shit ton of Anadrol like a lot of the other powerlifters. However, he said when he used it, he got next to nothing out of it. Very interesting. This guy is obviously a genetic marvel, or else he wouldn't have had such insane deadlift numbers. Like the guy is a fucking superior athlete, and yet he responds like shit to a compound that a lot of people hype the fuck up because they respond so well to it. So does that make Anadrol a subpar agent? No, a lot of guys respond extremely well to it. It's just Pete Rubish on the one hand doesn't. So therefore that compound, despite it being like one of the first reach to agents for powerlifters, does not seem to agree with him, and he, went down a different route and would leverage the Trenbolone a bit harder. I'm not saying you should do that or you should do one or the other. I'm just saying this is an example of, just because you have even a guy with insane genetic phenom genetics Genetic phenom genetics. Couldn't have thought of two different words for that. Doesn't mean he's going to respond to compounds the same as a guy who might have inferior genetics overall, but has better response to that particular drug. If you have a headache and you take ibuprofen versus Tylenol, you know, maybe one is better at getting rid of your headache than the other. Some people, when they take antibiotics, some people respond very well to one, whereas they don't to another. Whereas the next guy, they respond fine to the one that you didn't respond to. This is the kind of shit that also has translation over into the performance enhancing realm and often goes overlooked because if people want to see what did this guy's cycle consist of, I have to replicate that, when in reality, despite it being like the ideal scenario would be you are a hyper responder to all of the right compounds. And when I say right, I mean compounds that have, again, the most safety data, the most clinical research on humans, blah, blah, blah. It would be great if everyone responded the same to all the same shit. But at the end of the day, copying another guy's cycle is definitely not going to be what is going to work best for you in many cases. And especially when you factor in like sports specific applications, it's almost definitely not going to be the same thing. Maybe if you're comparing, you know, other athletes in your actual domain for what you're trying to apply it for, you know, it makes a little bit more sense to look at the kind of cycles they're using, but it doesn't mean that those specific drugs you're also going to respond exactly the same to. You might need to look in other avenues to find things that you respond better than, or, you know, even average to. Like maybe you respond like horribly to one compound that every other athlete is like heavily abusing, you know? Like it's hard to say what's going to happen. And ultimately, a lot of this is genetic response and individual variability between things. So again, I think the dianabol versus anadrol one is it's not necessarily an example of two like, you know, like safe, like tried and true drugs that you should be choosing between. That's not what I'm trying to say at all. It's just a very obvious a very relatable example, I feel like, for guys who are trying to kind of wrap their head around what I'm trying to refer to. Because a lot of guys who have, you know, tried anabolics have at least once tried D-bol and have at least once tried anadrol. And it's like a pretty obvious difference in your performance when you try a drug like this versus something that's like background pure protein expression. It might not be as obvious as to what's going on and what you respond better to. But something like a D-bol or anadrol is very obvious what the difference is, and it becomes pretty fucking clear like which one you respond better to. So I feel like that's the most relatable example I can really say here. Not that it's really relevant, again, to, you know, like safer compounds for, you know, what you could be using, but I'm just saying an example. Like just because one guy responds insanely well to test plus primo, and, you know, primo on paper being, you know, like one of the best anabolic agents you can be using as far as how refined it is, how well tolerated it is, how side effect free it is relative to other compounds. It doesn't mean you're going to respond exactly the same as another guy to primo just because it works well for him. Maybe you need to be using something else, you know, maybe you're going to be a hyper responder to that. So at the end of the day, all this video is boiling down to is the fact that do not take another guy's cycle and assume it's going to be the best for you and deploy compounds arbitrarily because, you know, fill in the blank pro uses it, or, you know, this person says this is the best compound. Like, yeah, there are compounds that are probably more ideal that it would be hopeful that you respond to, but if you don't respond to them very well, ultimately you need to find something that is going to be better for your goals, and especially for your specific athletic endeavors, not using a bodybuilder cycle to be a fucking professional sprinter, or to, you know, take a strongman cycle and go do a fucking, I don't know, play on a basketball court. Like obviously the application I would think is like obvious that it's going to differ, but then on top of that, the actual compound deployment, even in that specific niche, will vary based on your own genetic response to those different drug candidates. So just keep that in mind, because I think a lot of people do shit based on arbitrary pre-designed cycles that other people are doing that they think are the thing they should be doing just because another guy who looks good does it, or, you know, performs well does it. And maybe you respond like shit, you know? Like there are a lot of individuals who are just like non-responders to certain compounds, and it's not, you know, a knock on your genetics necessarily, because you could be, you know, a Pete Rubish who's a fucking genetic specimen and a half, but responds shitty to anadrol, for example. Just a very good example in my opinion. So anyways, hopefully there was some takeaway from that, because I think a lot of guys do get, you know, wrapped in their head there are like the perfect compounds. And like, yeah, again, like I said, there are compounds that it would be more ideal if you would respond well to them based on the safety data more so than anything. And the lack of side effects relative to other things, not lack thereof, but relative to other things. But at the end of the day, it's going to boil down to your athletic endeavors and your needs, how you respond to this shit, And again, even sometimes compounds that traditionally might be more like toxic, maybe your body tolerates them better, you know? Maybe your organs can sustain, you know, certain things better than others. Maybe a traditional compound that is seen as like safe by a lot of people is like shitty for you, not only in a performance aspect, but in a health aspect, you know? Not everyone is going to respond the same, and that's ultimately the takeaway at the end of the day. A lot of this does come down to learning your own biology and your own individual response to things, and, you know, being versatile rather than just getting very dogmatic about what you should and shouldn't be doing based upon what some guy, you know, has defined as the correct thing for you to be doing. So anyways, take from that what you will. Hopefully you guys enjoy that. Like, subscribe, check out my blog, moreplates.com. Follow me on Instagram at moreplates.dates, Facebook, Snapchat, BitChute, Twitter, TikTok, Apple Podcasts. If you want to support the channel, you check out anything I'm associated with in the video description below. My TRT clinic, it's all telemedicine from the comfort of your own home. Gorilla Mind. Nootropic formulas, Gorilla Mode, pre-workout formulas. I design myself from scratch. My recommended lab tests and diagnostics. Stay on top of your health and anything else I am associated with. It's all in the video description below. And obviously, again, one final comment, not even just about how you respond, but in a side effect aspect too. If you have crippling anxiety from a compound, just because you respond well in a muscle building context, perhaps, it doesn't mean that's an ideal compound for you. You know? So you have to, like, all of these things have to be cumulatively factored in when you're deciding on your compound selection. Some people respond amazingly to nandrolone and feel great on it. Some people get brutal anxiety to a point that they can't even use it. You know? It's all individual dependent. So thank you guys for watching. Talk to you soon.